So over the next 4 weeks, until we sort of move into our summer schedule, we'll be talking in this hour about deepening our reading of sacred texts. Today, we're going to sort of go through the various biblical genres and what it means to read the Bible through the lens of genre, and how understanding the genre of a particular biblical text can help us figure out how to read and interpret it. Next week, we'll look at truth versus fact, which of course is, all facts are true, but it doesn't necessarily work in the other direction, right? Like we can have truth that is not based on facts. And when we get into the biblical sort of record, that's often a question. How much do we take as literal? How much do we take as a different sort of truth? And how much does it matter whether the truth we get from the scriptures is based in fact and historicity or not? So we'll discuss that next week. The week following that, we'll get deeper into the Gospels, look at authorship, the timing of when the various Gospels were written, the perspective or agenda of the Gospel writers and their audience, and how understanding all of those things helps us to, read any particular gospel a little bit better and interpret it a little bit better. And then finally, on June 4th, we're going to get into context and how understanding, and all of these things sort of go to help us understand the context, the original context, right, of whatever scripture we're reading. And the connection between modern meaning making and original context, right? Because we don't want to, I read a quote recently that said something to the effect of, a piece of scripture cannot mean what it never meant. And so we always want our current understanding to be connected in some way to the original intent and context. So today, how to do this? We'll dive into genre and how genre informs meaning. I really liked this quote. Understanding genre allows us to begin to perceive the forest, not just the trees, right? And so when we're looking at a particular tree, like sort of figuring out, what its context is, helps us to understand, why it's there, right? And the Bible, right, is a book, but it's also a library, right? It's 66 different books. And each book occupies at least one genre, or, and then many books have many genres in them, right? And so it's sort of like opening the Bible is a little bit like walking into a bookstore where every row, like you've got the biography row and the history row and the poetry aisle, right? And so like you're going to read those books differently according to like what section you find them in, right? We're going to read a poem differently than we're going to read a biography. And so we all know that the genre, literary genres, film, music, whatever, it's identified by a specific form, content, and style, right? Which helps us to understand where it fits in the larger picture. Like what I was just saying before. We're not going to go to a poem looking for an accounting of history, right? We're going to look for a different sort of truth. Right? And we're not going to read a scientific article to show us necessarily, like to walk us through the beauty of a thing, or the figurative, nature of a thing, right? So let's talk about what's your favorite genre, not necessarily in the Bible, it can be in the Bible, and why. Like we all will gravitate towards different types of writings with an idea of what we're going to get there. Okay? I like fiction, and I like memoir, not biography, because memoir more closely resembles fiction, right? It's true, but it tells a story in a particular way, right? With attention to the words and the details and the feelings that that those particular words and the way a thing is framed evokes. So for me, I'll read nonfiction, but I much prefer a memoir to a biography because in certain respects, because of the way that a memoir more closely relates to a novel, right? That's just the genre. I'm also more inclined to read a poem than I am a scientific article, right? It has to do with the way my own particular brain is wired, right? And so whatever it is that we're reading, we go into it with a sense of understanding what we're going to get out of it, right? Like what to expect from it. And we should approach the Bible in the same way if we really want the fullest meaning possible. Do we have any hands, any comments from the room or online? Just raise your hand, but go ahead, Lee.
When I was being raised, I was raised Methodist, and I was taught to look at the Bible as something inspired by God, and therefore I did not look at it as a piece of literature until I got to college. And I have to say that when that was, I took the classes in my it was more as literature, and it's all about looking at authors' intent. And I have to tell you, that was truly mind-blowing for me. And it really started me down a journey that, really changed the way I felt about religion and about my faith and about allowing me to question things. And I just, I've talked about this with Dawn before, that I think it's just so important how I taught my children that it's a sacred piece of our history, religious history, that it is literature. And I've taught them from the beginning that there are intents behind it, and because I think it's really important if people be able to approach the Bible that way.
Right. I mean, it changes our relationship with it, right? Mm-hmm. And if you've been raised in one particular way, and the way you have, and then there's this sort of, it can be really destabilizing to say, oh, well, maybe I'm not taking everything in this. I'm not going to give the same weight to every statement that's made in the Bible, right? I'm going to approach different things in different ways. With a fuller understanding of the author's intent and like what they were doing with the words that they chose and why, right? And why they framed a particular story or truth in this particular way. Yeah, we read it very differently when we come at it as a piece of literature, right? Confessional, written by as a faith document, right? By lots of different faithful people, with lots of different sort of personalities and agendas and writing strengths, right? Like just like I would prefer to read, or I would prefer to read a novel, but I'm better at a different sort of writing, right? So if I were going to write, a piece of something to convey a truth, like I'm going to write a sermon or a paper, not a poem or a narrative, right? And I take the biblical authors to operate in the same way, at least to an extent, right? So like how you write is gonna be related to your own strengths, your own perspective, how you think the story is, how you think it is best conveyed, right? You're gonna choose the genre that fits what you're trying to say. So when we approach it, with that sort of like, we let the biblical authors be human and ask what they're doing, what they're trying to tell us. We have a very different relationship to the Bible, right? That way. I love that you have, sort of given that to your kids from young, right? Because you grow up that way with the understanding that I can find my experience in this thing too, right? It's not just this sort of external thing that has been dictated to me, but I am interacting with it in a different way, right? And so like I find myself in the Bible in a different way. Yeah, thank you. Any other comments in the room or online before we move on to some of the particular genres? There are more of these than you think, perhaps. So let's run through the most common biblical genres. narrative, right? Narrative relays what happened according to the perspective and point of view, the agenda of the author. Narrative makes it the largest percentage of the Bible. We find narrative in Genesis, Exodus, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, lots more, right? In Acts. The Gospels are their own genre, but they also we could think of the Gospels as a sort of subgenre of narrative if we wanted to. And we'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. But when we're reading narrative, right, we want to read it a particular way, right? We want to look at discrete episodes that it's conveying. We want to identify the main characters, ask who they are. We read it the way we would read a piece of literature or a novel, right? Summarize. We want to understand the main conflict, the main message. What is the author trying to tell me in telling me this story? Poetry, right? We know poetry that conveying ideas through vivid language, figurative language, repetition, rhyme sometimes, metaphor. Most of the poetry we get in the Bible, of course, is in translation, so we're not looking for rhyme. But we know poetry when we see it. So the first book that comes to mind would be the Psalms, right? Psalms, Song of Solomon, Lamentations. When we read poetry, particularly when we read the Psalms, reading the Psalm in its entirety, like we would read any other poem, is going to be the key to sort of understanding the context of any particular verse in the Psalm, right? We're paying attention to structure. What gets repeated? That's going to be more important, right? We're going to, in poetry, they're going to repeat the things that they want us to pay attention to. What imagery are they using and why, right? Why choose this word to describe God or to describe humanity, right? And we're asking what it's trying to say about God and about us. Wisdom and poetry are very closely related, but they're not the same. The wisdom writings are often on much more practical topics than the poetry writings we find in the Bible. And like in the word description itself, right? Collecting of wise sayings. This is meant to form and inform the moral lives of the readers. And so for in the wisdom category, obviously Proverbs, also Job, right? Also Ecclesiastes, and perhaps the book of James. But like poetry, like reading not just a verse at a time, but a much bigger chunk is going to help us put it in context too, right? And we're also, when we're reading wisdom literature, asking what is the ultimate truth that it's trying to convey. We're paying attention to the context. Like if you've read Job, that's especially important, right? To understand what we're trying to get from the book of Job, we want to understand the entire story that Job is telling. And then we're asking what it's saying about the speaker, what it's saying about God. Prophecy, always framed as a message from God, right? Often of warning, sometimes also a message of comfort. Often those two things are side by side. Here's the reason you should be, on your back foot, right? Here's the reason you should be looking at cleaning up how you're acting, right? And here's the reason that you can have faith that God is with you nevertheless, right? So it's sort of placing God's expectations for us and the consequences often side by side. So words of warning, words of comfort to God's people. And spiritual lessons, right? Regarding the nature of God, the expectations of God, and how we're measuring up as God's people.
Hey, Sarah, this is Becky. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was driving and you're going through these different genres, and I'm wondering if it'd be okay to make a comment on your earlier conversation about biography and what we choose.
Sure.
And and sorry for the interruption, but I think even in your description of these different genres that are available in the Bible, this is what strikes me. What I prefer in part depends on what I need or want. So sometimes, like the Psalms or poetry or something that speaks more directly to my heart and experience is something that feeds me or provides a solace or inspiration that is what's necessary. And so I really appreciate you actually delineating the different things that are available. And it was interesting for me to hear your comment about memoir and biography, because I also really like nonfiction, sort of for the same reasons I think that you said. And oftentimes, though, I prefer a biography over a memoir because it seems to me it provides a context, either historical or social, that helps me place the individual's experience in time and place. And so I'm finding, and again, I appreciate your different definitions of the genres available, because I have to say, what I really love about the gospel, and when there's teachings or conversations about the gospel, are information, facts, or context that helps root it more directly in their current experience. So whether it's like the geography of the place, or the political or the social, or even sort of the daily customs living, that to me is really helpful in figuring out what it might mean, and certainly what it meant to them at the time. So I'm really excited for this, and I'm sorry to interrupt in the middle of your teaching about it, but I was driving and I wanted to pull over and just make the comment. So thank you, Sarah.
No, this is great. Thank you, Becky. And also interrupt anytime. This is much better as a discussion than as just me talking, right? And Becky, I really loved your point about choosing different genres according to what we're looking for, what we need at any given time, right? Sometimes I want to, if we're talking about biblical literature, right? Sometimes I want the poetry of a psalm, right? But sometimes I go to scripture for, to read specifically what Jesus would say or do, right? To get a specific sort of teaching, right? It depends on what we're needing and what we're trying to learn or to get at any particular point.
Yeah.
So, understanding the differences between what we're going to encounter in the scripture also helps us to figure out where to go to get what we need, right?
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. That's great. So prophecy, big in the Old Testament, right? We have the 4 major prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. 12 minor prophets, Hosea through Malachi. Of course, we meet John the Baptist in the New Testament, which is our probably main example of prophecy in the New Testament, although not only. And when we're reading prophecy, we want to listen to the whole oracle. What's the bigger message from the prophet, in order to understand any given verse or passage within that larger message, right? What is the historical context that the prophet is writing from, speaking from, talking out of, right? And we're asking what the prophecy is asking us to understand about God. And that, of course, is always related through the historical context and through the human-God relationship. So also related to what the prophet wants us to understand about the people, right? And about ourselves as modern readers. Gospels are closely related to narrative, but Gospels are a little bit different because they are proclamation, right? They use a narrative approach, but are faith documents, right? The Gospels are always saying specific things, or are always talking about Jesus in particular. It's a very specific word. So the Gospels are narrative about Jesus. Of course, we know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are our gospels. Reading gospels, we're reading them in very similar ways to reading narrative, right? Looking at the episodes or events that are happening, the boundaries between those events, but also the boundaries of the physical world, in which the gospelers and the subjects of the gospel are operating. There's a lot of shared stories across the gospels, right? And so it can be really helpful to look for a particular story across gospels and see how it's conveyed differently. And of course, we'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks. But we also want to pay attention to the author's perspective, right? Matthew writes from a different set of assumptions than Luke does. And so, we'll convey the same event possibly in very different ways. Right? We think about the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, right? And those are conveyed in very different ways. We also want to look for their editorial comments, right? The gospelers are always saying, they're framing the scene, right? They're setting us up to understand things in a particular way. And so they're going to highlight particular details to sort of signal to us what we are looking for, or how to read this. And so to pay attention to the little editorial comments that they make in the Gospels are going to help us understand the agenda, the perspective, and what they want us to take away. And then, of course, with Gospels, because they're specifically about Jesus, narrative about Jesus, the number one question we're asking is, what picture of Jesus is this giving me, right? What is this? What is being conveyed about Jesus? What am I supposed to understand? Parables, I think of as a subgenre in the Gospels, right? We know that Jesus spoke in parables in order to communicate lessons through metaphors or similes. Like God is like a woman with a coin, or so we have like the simile thing, or we have there was a man who had two sons. Right? And so when we're reading parables, we're listening for the lesson, right? We're also asking who the various characters represent. Is God represented in the parable? Maybe, maybe not. It's always good to ask, not assume, right? And is God the person that we assume is the represented in the parable? Maybe, maybe not, right? It's good to keep asking the questions. Ask where we find ourselves. Ask how we can understand the various characters that are represented, because in a parable, all the characters are symbols in some way, right? They're symbolic. Just a few more. Epistles are letters. They're letters for specific occasions, right? And to specific people or groups of people. So often it's a description of what faith looks like. What does discipleship look like? What does Christian life look like? Or addressing particular problems or questions that have arisen in a community or with a particular person. Sometimes they're just for encouragement. Obviously, all the letters from Paul. As an aside, many of the letters that we say are letters from Paul are not. About half of the letters from Paul, scholars think were written by Paul. Some of them are disputed, and some of them are what we call pseudepigrapha, which means they're written by somebody else and falsely attributed to Paul. And then we have ones that are not.
Which was accepted.
Which was
an accepted genre.
Right, accepted genre. The thing that gets confusing, right, is when we lose that as a genre, and instead attribute it to Paul, right? We might be reading it incorrectly, right? So I love that you used that word genre, right? Because, right, it's not just a mistake, it's a genre, but understanding it as a genre, we're going to read it very differently than if we don't understand that genre. Always good to read the entire letter if we're trying to interpret a portion of it, right? Because that is the context, right? So we're going to ask about the context of the entire letter, ask about the context outside the letter, right? The setting, the audience, the person to whom the letter was written. Usually has an introduction and a conclusion that's easy to sort of skip right over. You may have noticed in worship within the last month, it's just been 2 or 3 weeks, I think, the entire epistle reading was simply the introduction. And that was the entire passage that the lectionary had assigned for that day. It was simply the introduction of the letter. And the introduction often has a lot of information, right? It's saying, this is who I am, this is how I identify, and this is who I'm talking to, right? And I'm talking to you out of this sort of faith context, like I am, Paul, servant of Christ, blah, 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 blah. So it's going to give you context about, what is coming later in the letter. And I just thought it was so interesting that the entire lectionary reading was just the introduction. So easy to skip those, but often have a lot of important information. And then we want to trace the logic of the letter, because they're occasioned, they have their own internal logic. And often Paul will sort of he's laying out in some of his letters like a theology. And so it unfolds, verse by verse and chapter by chapter. And so in order to trace the logic of the letter, it's important to read the whole thing. Apocalypse is similar to prophecy, but the main difference between apocalypse and prophecy is that the warning, whatever this sort of urgent message is coming in the form of, in symbolic form or in the form of metaphor, instead of simply as the proclamation of a prophet, right? We think of Revelation, right? But then we also find it other places. In Daniel, specific parts of Isaiah, specific parts of Matthew and Mark, for example. And the interesting thing about Apocalypse is that a lot of the symbolism and metaphor that it uses is used elsewhere in Scripture. And so if we're running into symbols that we don't understand, it's helpful to ask where else this occurs in Scripture and what it represented there. And we'll do an example of that in a few minutes here. Again, with like prophecy, you want to read the whole thing in order to understand what it's saying. So lifting out a few verses out of context is not going to give us the same meaning as reading the whole thing would.
Sarah, can I hop in for just a second?
Yes, Mark, please do.
So I had a comment about prophecy, and then when you talked about apocalypse, it really spurred me on to say it, that I would love to learn more about prophecy and apocalypse, because I have the sense that it is often popularly misunderstood, or maybe I have just misunderstood it as predicting the future, which doesn't mean anything to me. What's more meaningful is to understand it as, the prophet is telling the world around him something deep that they are missing about God. Right. So I like the whole thing about predicting the future just seems, like dumb to me.
I thank you for that comment, Mark. I think that's so important, because it's sort of like the difference between sort of fact and symbol, right? They're not trying necessarily to say this is what's going to happen, right? They're trying to say something about who God is, about the relationship between God and God's people, about the ways in which that relationship has been transgressed, right? And a word of warning about that sort of transgression, right? And so if we're not reading it through that lens of relationship and symbolism, but really, the experience of God and the experience of this sort of broken relationship between God and God's people. If we're not reading it through that lens, then there's really no way to understand it. If we go to Revelation and we read it like either an account of history or a prediction of what is going to happen, it looks like nonsense, right? Because this doesn't match my experience of the world in any way.
Or it could lead to awful things that you're doing in the world,
Right,
like Israel Palestine.
right. So, yeah, thank you, Sari. Right, it can also be permissive in a way that is, was never intended. And so getting back to this sort of like mismatch between that we get when we make a text mean something that it was never intended to mean, right? We get really far afield that way. Great point. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Right, so we should, when reading Apocalypse, we should expect metaphor, we should expect symbolism. We're not going into it, to Mark's point, really, expecting literalism. And so we also want to interpret parts in light of the whole, because that's the only way that they make sense, right? This is something that hangs together. Law, obviously meant to instruct, lay out God's covenant with the nation of Israel. We find it in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And when we're, so Old Testament law generally is what we find in the Bible. And so we want to identify what sort of law, what is this pertinent to? How does it fit into the broader context of the life of these people with God? What is it saying about God's values, God's expectations, about human nature and the guardrails that we perceive ourselves needing, or that we understand ourselves to have received from God in order to be in right relationship with one another? And then finally, history, right? Recounts in the Bible, history recounts is a specific history, right? History of God's people. That should be the people's response. So God's people, our response to God, and it tells this sort of family history between God and God's people. And we find that all over the place in the Old Testament. And of course, with history, whenever we're reading history, we're paying attention to the sequence of events, the chronology, who the major actors are, the relationships between people, yes, but also between nations and cultures. And we're looking for the lessons to carry forward, right? If this happened in the history between God and God's people, what do we need? What do we need from that as modern people in relationship to God? Where does God show up in history? If we're reading the Bible, this account of the history between God and God's people, it also sort of can train our eye to see God showing up in our own lives. Okay, so I want to do this example together. Among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. Does anybody know where this is from?
It sounds like Revelations.
Indeed, it is from the book of Revelation. And so we are reading what genre? Apocalypse, yes. And so we see like this sort of list of all of these symbols, right? And like, what does it mean for us to say, Jesus looked, this is obviously not a literal description of Jesus, right? We have hair that was white as wool, white as snow, eyes like fire, feet glowing like a furnace, voice like water, right? What is this writer trying to get us to understand about Jesus? What is he trying to say, right? And so as we talked before, usually the symbols in Apocalypse are familiar symbols, right? We can think of them as recycled, right? He's taking them from somewhere else where they already have context and meaning to the people that will now be reading this new writing. And so it helps to, for the author of an apocalyptic book to borrow this symbol from over here because the audience already knows what it means, right? So robe and sash. echoes how priests were dressed in the Old Testament. We have this image in Leviticus, right? And so we're saying something particular about Jesus, and we have him dressed as a priest. Hair like wool recalls the language in Daniel, where God is described in the same way. And we could go back to Daniel and figure out where that is and like why, why described in that way, right? Because maybe
Yeah, exactly.
There you go. So understanding and that's so interesting, right? That's understanding the context, the larger context of even the genre that we're referring to, right? And we have this sort of line, this sort of thread, right? We understand the context way back here. We bring it to this reading, right? And then we're going to bring that to our modern interpretation of it. Go ahead. Penny.
In the first line, why does it say someone like a son of man instead of the son of man? It's someone like the son of man, which I would, I thought someone who looked like a human being.
Mm.
I didn't think it was Jesus. I just thought it was just an image. Some supernatural vision of a person.
Yeah. Well, he's describing his own vision here, right? And this is at the very beginning of it. And so I would assume that it is exactly what you're talking about, right? This sort of idea of, describing this experience of this looks like a particular thing, right? And then the more I pay attention to these details, the more it becomes clear what it looks like.
He's reporting what his vision, but he's not interpreting.
Not yet, right? This is the very beginning. So when he says, this is the very beginning of the chapter, right? And so he is transcribing his own experience, I would say, of this vision, right? In this vision, I see someone who looks like the son of man, a son of man. And it was like this, and it was like this, and it was like that. And so he is walking us through his vision in the same way, I imagine it became clear to him in understanding it, right? I think we could read it that way.
This makes your point perfectly because Daniel 7:13 said, in my vision in the night, I continued to watch and I saw one like a son of man.
Ooh, there it is. So
To go straight to what you're saying is like, that is language that's code. People knew immediately where it was coming from.
right. And like that gets lost for us as modern readers, right? Because we don't know it as well, right? We have to. I had Sarah bring this in because it is so helpful if you're using an annotated version of the Bible, right? If we're going to be attentive to genre, if you use a Bible that has footnotes, the footnotes are going to tell you where the other scripture references are, right? And so, when we're reading Revelation, it's going to say, this is a reference to Daniel. This is a reference to Leviticus in the notes. And so like that, without an encyclopedic knowledge of biblical literature, right, of the 66 books of the Bible, this really helps us to figure out what the genre is and like what we're supposed to understand from it, right, and from the references. This passage just keeps going on in this way. Eyes like fire, straight from the language of Daniel again, right, and to denote a celestial being. Feet like bronze, straight from Micah, where Israel is said to have been given feet like bronze to trample out the enemy, right? So this is saying a particular thing about who God is, who Jesus is, what this Son of Man is like. Sword out of the mouth, symbol of judgment through his word that is taken straight from Isaiah and from Hebrews. And then voices rushing water. It's taken straight from Ezekiel. So all of the symbolism in these first couple of sentences of Revelation is recycled. And the contemporary readers of this would have, like, a lot of those would have been really familiar, right? And they would have understood that this is a reference to other sacred texts.
It's an appeal to say, my prophecy has validity because it's connected to all of this old scripture.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, so it's prophecy, right? But it's also, you know, it's a little bit different than that when we're talking about apocalyptic, right? So he's not necessarily saying my prophecy has validity because I'm using these symbols. He's saying he is writing a piece of literature using these familiar symbols to, as a writer, make these connections with this picture that he's painting very clear, right? It's sort of like reading a satire. I would say that apocalyptic is sort of like satire in that way, in that it's like using these symbols in order to, you know, make these points.
So the audience will be recognizing familiar language and situations as he, when they read this.
Exactly,
It's like unspoken reference.
exactly,
If they're embedded, but the audience who's reading knows will recognize.
exactly.
They don't need the annotated version.
They don't need the annotated version. I do.
But the thing is though, the non-audience who doesn't know the symbols won't know what he's talking about.
That's clear, or the way
Yes.
it's read.
But no, but it's like,
Thinking about that.
but you think about if it's. you wanna
No,
say-
go ahead. No, I know.
If you're threatened by the empire. And you want to communicate with others, and you want to use language that the empire is not going to understand. That you would use apocalyptic language.
Yeah, that reminds me of World War II. People would publish plays or poems or novels that were set at a different time, but they were read by the audience as about being about in resistance to the Ottoman forces.
Right. Right, like satire, right? It's sort of written in this sort of encoded way. You know, and like in your example, that has the effect of sort of softening, you know, what the message, so that you can't point a finger at it, right? It's about it, but it's not really about that.
It's really about hypocrisy.
Right, exactly, exactly. The other thing that Sarah, your comment reminded me of is like, it's like what happened under slavery, right? It's like what happened among the slaves. You know, you have this sort of, like, we get the term code switching, right? Because we have this sort of vernacular that happened in this sort of set of symbols that enslaved people in America could communicate to one another using, that was not intelligible to the slave holders, right? And so you have whole stories that are written that way, you know, in addition to just the language practices, right? Like the Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox stories, right, are a kind of an example of of telling a story through symbols, you know, that is unintelligible to the same way to the dominating class, right? Carl.
Carl, one of the points of
Yes,
the,
please.
sort of the downside of it is that the modern audience, if you aren't looking at it and what it really means, then you get people waiting for raptures to take you up and to go after this, right? And it sort of helps me understand why we have so many crazy versions of Christianity, right?
Right,
I mean, really negative versions of it, because they have no idea what they're reading.
right, yeah, it's so important to sort of like step back, right, trace it back to the original intent so that we can sort of figure out what is actually being said.
And
Yeah.
do you know how the original audience, I mean, like, so I was thinking about the Gentiles who were converted to Christianity, they wouldn't necessarily have this understanding of the Old Testament. So could they then take these words in a different way than their Jewish brethren?
I would say that this is one of the arguments for reading scripture in community, right? That we are,
I was just gonna say, that's why it's
Right.
Yeah, well, that's why we have sermons, that's why we have Bible studies, that's why we read it and talk to each other about it, right? Because we learn how to read it from in part, from the tradition. I want to go to Carl real quick, because he's had his hand up for a while, and then Pam, I see your hand too. Go ahead, Carl.
I'll be quick. So it's just, I was just reflecting, I believe that the name apocalypse in Greek, and I may be wrong here, I may be misremembering something, but I think it meant the uncovering, kind of like the decoding, which is not really contradicting anything you're saying about it being code, but it's an interesting perspective that it's both kind of like a prophet, truth telling, and at the same time, it's a little bit hidden because it's in code. Anyway.
Right, yeah, no, perfect. Thank you for lifting that up. That's exactly right. Pam, you had a comment.
This recalls to me that my grandfather used the Bible. He would just let the Bible, he would let the Bible fall open, and then he would glance amongst the random great phrases and find something that he thought was a message from God, and I was like, and I don't think that was his original idea. I mean, I think there are other people that do that, but this Sarah said, I think we need to read this in community and listen to.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and Pam, I don't think that's an uncommon thing, right? It's not an uncommon way to use the Bible. But it does completely divorce it from its context and turns it into, a divining rod of some sort, right?
Part about take your son up on the mountain instead of burning on an altar. That's not a good message.
Not a Mother's Day.
Right, yeah, and so we don't want to take that out of context, right? So we get a very different meaning from it if we sort of divorce it from its context and its intent. So just before we move on, the text in purple actually goes to the point that you were making, Sari, right? All of these symbolic references combined with the context that the audience was under Roman persecution and needing encouragement, right? We get this much more understandable, intelligible reading of this text than without those things, without understanding the context in which it was written, of the audience, and all of these symbolic references it makes. But with those two things combined, we have a Christ who is presented as a priest to his people, who is prepared to judge, who is prepared to trample out the enemy, right? And then also citing the words of Isaiah, I am the first, I am the last. That's not in the part that I cited, but it's in the very next part. Let's do a couple more little examples. This is the first sentence of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land. A certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. Ruth is what genre? Narrative. And those are often side by side too, right? A narrative and history. The difference with narrative is it's going to talk about something in order to it's trying to tell us more than the history, right? It's arranged in a story in some way to try to give us an additional dimension to just what happened. So from this first sentence, we learn a variety of things, right? When the judges ruled, tells us that we're operating under Mosaic law. And if we have read our Old Testament, we know a little bit about what that means. Famine in the land, right? Tells us also a little bit about, what's going on and maybe how that was being interpreted. And then also we have reference to this sort of foreign land. And so we know what to expect by that reference as well, right? foreign, pagan, there's this otherness. And so just the one first line of Ruth is giving us all of this information to sort of help set the stage and tell us what to expect in the rest of the book. It's a different example. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. What book are we in? Psalms. So we are reading, it's not arranged like poetry. That didn't trick anybody. We're reading poetry. What's the operative metaphor in this little bit?
Trees on the western side.
Right.
Trees.
Right, so, and what does that image conjure?
Literally.
Right, and there's prosperity, there's this sort of lushness, we're talking about a region that's pretty arid, and we're talking about the people that delight in the law of the Lord are planted by the water, right? And we have this sort of lush nourishment, the abundance of good things, right? And so we're looking in this psalm, right? What's the metaphor? What is the metaphor in context? What is the trying? And so if we understand the metaphor in its ancient context, what is it trying to tell me in my present?
Can I throw in something?
Yes, Mark, go ahead.
So it also, for me, conjures up nature. And it's saying, this is your true nature, to be rooted in God.
I love it. Right. Thank you. Exactly. Okay. Sometimes genre gets messy. Is Genesis 1 history? Is it poetry? Is it narrative? Right? and so, depending on how we want to read it, we're going to understand different things from it, right? And sometimes it's not just one, one answer, but, asking about the genre was going to help us determine, do we want to take this literally? Did God create the cosmos in 7 days? Do we want to take it metaphorically? If we don't think that God actually created the cosmos in 7 days, what is that trying to tell us about God, about creation, about its structure, right? And about how it supports us, right? And so depending on what a given genre is, and sometimes those lines are blurry, we might want to read it in a variety of ways, sort of see how we can understand, get different meanings, right? There's not necessarily just one meaning in a text either. As a subgenre, parables can get a little messy too, right? Because it's interrupting another genre, generally narrative. And so we have to pay attention to where the parable begins and ends, what's included in the parable and what isn't, because the parables are sort of like these sort of self-contained capsules. Right. And so we don't want to bring other things into the parable because the parable tells its own story and is already a whole. We want to ask about the context around it. What generated the parable? What was the context that made Jesus decide to tell this particular story in this particular way? But we want to understand the difference between two things that are going. Can you think of any other sort of examples of genres colliding in the Bible or being, or, where you have one sort of inside another one?
love your enemy. That's metaphorical, right? That's not.
Nice. That's such a good example, right? You want to go, well, if I play with the genre a little bit, can I get the reading that I want out of the Bible? Right? That's an interesting. Thank you, Sari. John the Baptist is the first thing that I thought of, right? Because we have prophecy inserted into a larger narrative, right? And when we read the New Testament narrative, you know, we read it as a narrative, but when we're reading the words, the particular words of John the Baptist, we read that as prophecy and we interpret it in a particular way. Right? What is he saying? What's the message he's given his, you know, his listeners about who God is, about what they should expect, about what is to come, and you know, what's the relationship between that prophecy and the larger context in which we find it. And then we also have Jesus always quoting Psalms, Isaiah, quoting the Hebrew scriptures. Lots of the books of the New Testament do, right? But when we miss that that's a quote, we miss all of the inferred context that the person who chose the quote, whether it was Jesus or a, you know, writer of a different book, sometimes it's Paul, what they're trying to bring into the understanding. New Testament professor Dean Deppy says the determination of genre is crucial to detecting the meaning of literary texts. Like an infrared lens, it offers a photo of what we don't always observe in normal light. Genres trigger different expectations and therefore demand divergent reading strategies, right? So we want to ask, what is our goal when we read the Bible? You know, if we, the way, Pam, the way your dad read the Bible, right, has a very different goal than if we're, you know, reading to, you know, understand what happened or, you know, or what God is saying, you know, to us through a certain text. Sharon, I see your hand. Go ahead. Sorry, I got distracted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so listening to all this, I find it, of course, really fascinating and enjoying it very, very much. I'm distracted a bit thinking about friends I know who interpret the Bible literally, and it's making me think about power differentials getting in the way. I'll explain a little bit. So I was thinking about, so that was the early Christian leaders that decided what would be in the Bible, what was canon. These were, of course, Catholics, and later there was a movement against the abuse of power of the Catholic Church. Fast forward to today, we have economic segregation in our country that leads basically to lack of access for all to quality public education, to college education. And so it seems like the fact that, you know, you need all this education to properly understand the Bible feels like it's facilitating like gatekeeping. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can, yeah, I do hear that. I wonder if sort of reading in community is one of the purposes to feeling like it's just a wall, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of like some pastors don't even go to college, you know, they just come out of high school, maybe even don't even graduate college. You know, for some communities, they have pastors that maybe haven't even graduated high school, let alone college, you know, and they think that it should be taken literally. And I think, you know, I think that's one of the many divides we have in our country right now. So I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I was just so distracted with it. I wanted to share.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. And you know, like that's it creates real danger when we're reading the same text in a lot of different ways, right? Then we're sort of like all claiming ownership of the same text but making it say very different things. And it gets very, like, how do we figure out where God's voice is when we're reading it in so many different ways? I mean, that is, for me, precisely why this sort of thing becomes so important, right? When we you know, agree that like genre is a thing, and so we attend to genre in the Bible, right? It sort of helps put us on the same page together, so we're all understanding the context, right? We're not just opening it up and pointing to a word and saying, well, you know, this is the word that God has for us today. Maybe the word that God has for us today, we find through understanding genre and context and looking to a similar story in the Bible that, you know, as what we're experiencing experiencing in our lives. It helps to, if we can understand genre, when we know what we're reading, we know where to look for what we need too. Pam, go ahead.
When I'm reading the Bible now as an adult, the heretical, I guess, for some people thought comes to me that this is not the direct word of God, because if God had written this book, he would have done this.
You wouldn't understand it.
There's that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
He would have like, first of all, you know that gospel parallels, you put the gospel verse next to it, and some of them are the same, and some of them contradict each other. Well, God would make sure if there were going to be 4 gospels, or there wouldn't even need to be 4, if God was, you know, dictating, you know, the total truth to somebody, and they were just writing it down. And also, what frustrates me about the gospels is that Jesus seems to like be standing there and he suddenly says something oracular, you know, and you think like, I don't believe that's all he said. These people were together all day wandering around. They just had these long conversations, and we're getting what the surviving disciple could remember to write down in the gospel. And I feel like I wish you could fill in, you know, all these gaps, because I'm sure he had long conversations. He didn't just, you know, come into a room and say, love thy enemy. That was in a context of a lot of stuff was going on. And it just makes me-
Can I say something?
Yeah, kind of time travel, but then of course I would be a woman and I wouldn't understand the language, you know. It's just, I just find it a fascinating book, but also so complicated and mysterious, and I don't think the mysteries are going to be solved by me in my life, but I just keep doing it. Yeah, because it just intrigues
I know we have to end, but I just want to say, like, so I think what Sarah's saying is that it's not, this is how much I can remember, like the gospel author. This is what the author wanted you to know. So they were selectively leaving things out, maybe even putting things in Jesus's mouth.
Right.
Because this is the message they want you to know. As opposed to like, this is all I can remember, I'm sure there's more things. You know.
Right. Right, I mean, that's exactly part of what I want to say, right? And I want, you know, like, so instead of just reading the Bible on the level of what does it mean to me, we want to ask what God's trying to communicate to me, right? And we use a variety of tools, right? Like genre, like context, right? Like reading it within tradition, within community, right? And reading it with our brains turned on, but also, you know, from our own experience. I think that's part of what genre points me to, is that all of these different writers in the Bible had their own experience of God, right? And their writings come out of that, right? So prophecy comes out of a very particular experience of who and how God is in relationship to, you know, this sort of life in the world and whatever hardship I'm under, right? And like poetry, right? The Psalms come out of this very different experience of who God is. So like, I always want to encourage people, like we use the context, we use the genre, we use the tools that we have. We cannot forget that our experience of God is the first tool that we have, right? It's the first tool that we have, and actually understanding biblical genres, I think helps us to understand that that experience is a universal and different part of you know, all of our words about God. So all of the words that we find about God in the Bible come from an experience, a particular person's particular experience of God, that needed to be given shape in the way that was going to do it the most justice, right? And so whereas, you know, I write in this particular way, right? I'm not going to choose to write a poem about God to convey my experience of God. I'm going to write a sermon or a paper or whatever. But I'm not always going to go to a sermon or a particular, or a, you know, Deuteronomy or whatever. And sometimes I want to go to Psalms because I want to hear about that experience of God. Right? And so I just want to, I want to end on the encouragement to use every tool at our disposal, and to highlight the link between genre and our own lived experience of God, because that's always one of the tools that we have to bring to bear when we're trying to understand who God is. So we ran over, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm so glad to be able to be in the room with so many of you, and also just to like have you all in this conversation. And I'm looking forward to the next few weeks.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks everybody who was joined us online. Happy Sunday.